Head down, you gotta have tunnel vision just to break the crowd. Some people will always be a bit thick in the head. Show out, well if you tell the truth they might scream and shout. You put in the work, now they're knocking dead. And I hope that we can laugh it off someday. But the best things happen when you let them come your way, yeah. And I know that we'll laugh it off someday. So head down for now. Head down where there ain't a lot of love coming from your town. These people wish they could sing but can't carry a tune. Slow down, it doesn't mean you're wrong when you've got your doubts. Be patient, it's all coming soon. And I hope that we can laugh this off someday. But the best things happen when you let them come your way, yeah. And I know that we'll be laughing it off someday. So head down for now. So head down for now.
Oh, every time. Always something missed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Greg Staley of Diverge Media. We're excited to have on our next guest. I believe him. I've had a few conversations with Russell. He's a sharp guy, and I know he's going to bring a lot to this conversation as we go in and have a general discussion about the Emergencies Act. Now, Russell has a podcast called CoffeeBreathConversations. We're going to bring him in now just to give a little more background about himself. How's it going, Russell?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
Good. Just for those that are new to you and what you're doing, do you just want to give them a bit of background about Coffee Breath and what you're doing over there?
Sure. So I run a podcast called Coffee Breath Conversations, and I interview different people, interesting people. And over time, the podcast has certainly gotten a lot more political. I found that's kind of been the niche. That's what's driven a lot more people to the show, is talking politics, talking with people around politics. I've had lobbyists. I had Tracy Wilson on the show. I had Maxime Bernier on the show. I've had a few different interesting people. And yeah, it's just having conversations with people about different topics of interest. And yeah, it's just kind of always been a passion of mine to debate with people, talk with people, kind of think the big picture on things. And it's nice to be able to have those conversations recorded, and then hopefully people find value in them.
Yeah, and that's something we strive to do, is provide value as well. A little background for those who don't know Diverge. Diverge Media, we came up with the name as a diverge from the mainstream. It's okay to be different. Our slogan is stories that matter, and truth falls where it falls. So that being said, we're excited. I'm excited to have a general discussion about the Emergencies Act. So far, we're in, day 20 now of hearings, and it's 6 weeks long altogether. But there's lots of patterns that have emerged in the testimonies. I think it's fair to say, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's been some very interesting patterns overall to the testimony. What's very interesting to me is that, and I discussed it with you previously, is that people can watch the inquiry and it's like two different shows on one screen. So if you believe that the convoy was not appropriate, that it was, illegal or anything like that, then you are going to find the evidence that supports that, and vice versa. And that's what I've really noticed. I follow different sources on the media, and I've quite often seen that certain media will post things that support their narrative, and the other media will post things to support their narrative, which is, I mean, it's the media, it's what it is. You're going to feed your followers the meat that they want, but
Which
it definitely, go ahead.
that's an unfortunate commentary on the state of media today, isn't it? I had to interrupt because you're gonna feed your audience what they expect to an extent, and it's unfortunately that it has become the practice of journalism, whereas it used to be, it's okay to not get along with people, be in the pursuit of truth. Your job's not to be a friend of everyone as a journalist; it's to pursue the truth at all costs. And we talked about this off air, but pursuing the opposite of your opinion and understanding the opposite point of view and covering both sides of the story is very rare these days. And those often that claim to cover both sides really are covering their version of events, or they don't really touch on the crux of the matters that need to be talked about. And when it comes to, we're talking about the EA, there's a narrative that's emerged that it started off good, it got bad, and then that led to the invocation of the EA. Basically, things got out of control. There wasn't, there's these different splinter groups, and they lost control, and this is where it's gone. But the opposite side of that story is there's actually two different narratives that have emerged from the testimony, and the second narrative that is conveniently being ignored is that actually, no, it didn't get worse. It got better. Because the other story that's being told, that's being missed, is that people converged on Ottawa, and there was all these different groups from all over this country. This is a massive country, bigger than the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire at their peaks combined. I don't think people understand how massive this country is. 2,600 kilometers from here, where I live, to get to my former house. It is a massive nation, and everyone converged in on Ottawa. This is the narrative that's been missed, and you had the excitement, you had a bunch of people there, they were honking, and then the injunction came in and it kind of cooled off. Whereas the other story we're getting is that it got worse and there was control lost, and then therefore EA. So I guess that's probably a good place to just lay out a general discussion point, and I'll let you take it from here.
Well, what I'll say about converging on Ottawa. Ottawa is a culture all on its own. It's the nation's capital. I've been to Ottawa several times. Every single time I go to Ottawa, something is going on Parliament Hill, the areas around Parliament. There's always protests going on. People are trying to get different causes, trying to get some traction for different causes. The difference this time is that this protest didn't follow the usual lines that you see with the modern day protest. They didn't get a permit. They didn't, consult with the police liaison ahead of time that I know of. It's possible that they did.
I think they did. And that I can't remember the individual. It came up in testimony, but there was somebody, my understanding was there was somebody on the ground about a week prior in Ottawa talking with the police team, like, hey, here's what we expect. But my understanding is like they were just blown away by the numbers. They didn't. Yeah. So this is BJ Tichter. He's testified. He's saying, yes, he did. Or yes, we did. But I don't think they ever expected what they got. And so we've seen video after video all across this great country of people lined up supporting it from coast to coast. And I just think it blew them away. I don't think they could have planned for how many people showed up from all over this country. And I think that's initially what shocked them. So there was somebody on the ground. I guess Chris Guerra was on the ground talking to the police beforehand. But then, I don't think anyone knew that it was going to, this is the biggest protest. Can you think of a bigger protest in the last 50 years off the top of the head? Like international coverage. It started as a domestic issue, I guess you could say, and quickly spurred to international and became a national embarrassment for Canada, really.
Well, the embarrassment for Canada was how it was handled. That was the embarrassment. That's the black eye right there. And yes, I stand corrected. someone that directly connected, saying that the police were contacted ahead of time. So I stand corrected. I don't want to be accused of spreading fake news. So thank you for correcting me on that.
And for the record, we're trying to get it right. This is an extremely vast subject. There's been so many testimonies. And if you just look at the commission and you go into, I think, one day worth of testimonies, like 330 pages of written document, just to give you an example of how much information has been presented. So you'll be forgiven if you don't have all the ducks in a row on it.
Well, here's the thing, though. What I heard is that the police testified that they didn't have enough resources, that things got out of control. To me, looking at the big picture, what the EA inquiry has shown is that our federal, provincial, and municipal governments are completely inept. They're completely incapable of doing anything properly. Their lines of communication are completely flawed at best, if not just downright non-existent, really. And I heard at one point from one person, we were surprised by this. Well, how were you surprised? This was known quite in advance, and even the media, well, we're only expecting a few trucks to show up, and trying to downplay how big the protest was going to be. And then when it turned out it was a big protest, then everyone panicked. I really felt like, that there was a lot of panic. And it was Tracy Wilson posted the Ottawa City Council the one night. They broadcast their city council meetings live, and I tuned in, and they're yelling at each other. They're blaming each other for things. Is that how useless our municipal electoral is? Is that really how useless they are? This whole protest, to me, showcases just how unprepared our government is for actual protests, not some sanitized protests where they get a permit and then everything, is wrapped up in a day or two. I'm talking a real protest, like similar to the protests that we saw where CUPE was ready to do across Ontario. And to me, they enacted the Emergency Act because they panicked. They didn't know what to do. They were so blown away. They realized that they were rapidly losing control of the narrative overall as well. It is a black eye. It is an embarrassment for Canada because there was no attempt to actually mediate or anything like that. From what I could see that the convoy organizers were trying to get to the table on these things. And from what I could see, the government was not reciprocating that at all.
I don't think there was, and this has come out in the testament, I don't think there's any interest from the beginning to really have a conversation with these people. Remember, Trudeau called them often racist and misogynistic, right? He painted anyone who was against the policies and the mandates that his government was putting out were immediately othered in the most severe of terms that they could find. But I want to touch on a point you talked about, and you talked about the Ottawa City Council at each other's throats during the height of this crisis. And I think it speaks to, you touched on it, a bigger problem in this country. If we can't trust our leadership in times of actual crisis, I'm not referring to Ottawa, because I'm not going to discount that it was a big inconvenience, that there was honking. It was probably unpleasant for a week maybe, and then it got better. I'm not going to deny that, but I don't think we're talking the same level of there's a terrorist threat to Canada and they're mobilizing in a city.
Well, what's interesting, and I'm going to interject on that. What's interesting is it depends who you talk to. If you talk to people that are diehard on the side that this was an illegal action through and throughout, you will hear a narrative that these convoy protesters were the equivalent to terrorists. I've heard that. On one of my Twitter threads earlier, someone was commenting saying that the convoy itself was filled with terrorists and that. And I get it. Hyperbole, I get it. but at the same time, no, they're not terrorists. And if that's what you think terrorism is, then you live such a privileged life. Am I allowed to swear on here?
We'll try to keep it clean because
Okay, all right.
I mean,
I won't swear then. Well, and
it
as
will come
BJ
across.
well, and as BJ says, like bots, like NPCs, right? They'll listen to anything the media tells them. They'll believe anything that's told to them, that and take it as the truth and fact. It's kind of crazy overall. Just this idea of, oh, something is inconveniencing me, so I expect the government is going to step in and solve it for me. And then the government can't solve it without using a heavy hand.
And to keep that big picture, I mean, the left versus right side of that, yeah, left wing, they bought into the, you know, the extreme narrative. They were literally domestic terrorists that had lost their jobs, lost their pensions, lost their homes on mandates that you applauded and pushed through. Okay, I'm assuming if you're okay with the one, you're okay with the other. A lot of this was like, we talked. I had a friend and was in school, needs 1,000 hours to hit her graduation, and she had finished the schooling 882 hours into her what do you call it, apprenticeship, I guess. 882 hours in out of 1,000, she gets an email from the school saying, hey, you need to go get the vaccine or you need to provide a religious exemption within a week. She now is out of school. And like we talked off, what do you expect those people to do? All they did was park and honk. And I realize that's not pleasant, but can we put it in perspective, please, of why they were there? As an example, how this personally affected me, I was unable to work at the warehouse that I worked at because just the way things shook out. And so I went to work on a Mennonite chicken farm so that I could be insured that, one, worst case scenario, I'll have food, but two, I knew I had a job. And this is the type of decisions that were going on. And I'm sure I got off easy. I didn't lose a pension. I didn't lose my house as a result of losing my job. These are things that happened. And they went to Ottawa, they parked, and they honked. They had bounty, like, you know what I mean? If we're talking about a domestic terrorist group, that's an interesting domestic terrorist group look. The bouncy castles, the hot tubs, the music. I get it. It wasn't pleasant for some people. But
like I said, people live in a very insulated bubble. The rioting and protests that go on against governments in other countries involve Molotov cocktails. It involves complete destruction of property. The G20 summit, I mean, black bloc, type people during the G20 summit all those years ago, Stephen Harper, the fake lake, all that sort of stuff. There's still video on YouTube of literally people wearing all black going around smashing windows and destroying things, and they were never charged with anything.
And then there's Wet'suwet'en protest too. That's also forgotten, throwing flaming pieces of debris onto rail tracks, blockading the rails where millions and millions of dollars per day were going. They met with protesters on top of never invoking the EA. They met with them, right?
Well, another thing too to consider, and the mandates overall, I don't know what people were expecting, especially people on the left. What did they think was going to happen when all these people got fired? They were denied EI. They were basically denied severance packages and that. What did they think was going to happen? That people were just going to go and kill themselves? Is that what they thought was going to happen? Probably that's what they hoped was going to happen. But no.
Leave of absence without pay was the go-to, right?
Yeah. So what did they expect was going to happen with all these people? Do they expect they were just going to go quietly into the night when they can't put food on the table for their families? What did these people really think? Did they really look at the big picture of taking a whole bunch of people that might be their ideological opponents and suddenly putting them out of work and suddenly just making everyday sort of things inaccessible to them? Did they think they were just going to sit there and take it? No, of course not. So when they say that they're surprised, when they act like they're surprised, they're full of crap. They really are.
There's
Because
2 years of gaslighting, 2 years of literally telling people, like, wow, the Toronto Star comes to mind, right? Do the unvaccinated deserve to die? And then they were taking polls, CTV, I think it was. Should we jail the unvaccinated? Like, this is the stuff you guys did for 2. Imagine the fear you put into someone when your mainstream media, your government, gets behind that kind of messaging. I know what it did. I lived it. It was the amount of times I was yelling at my walls because I couldn't believe this shit. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm reading the Toronto Star. I'm like, my kids are in the room, you know? And everybody gets emotional on the stand. I'm getting emotional now. I said, I didn't realize, I said to my wife, I didn't realize how sore this was for me, how raw it still was until I started covering it again. Because, man, I was, kudos to my brother. This messaging affected people to the core. I had family initially. Everybody came around because I was pretty firm on what I said, what I believed, and I backed everything up with articles, documents, etc. But I had family early on say, listen, I know you're covering protests. We don't feel comfortable. Don't come around. This was the messaging you put out. You constantly divided people. You told people if they weren't vaccinated, don't go to Thanksgiving dinner with them. I think it's time to cut the unvaccinated family loose. Messaging from your media said this. The government pushed it. They applauded it, and they arguably were far worse in their messaging. Again, what did you expect? They parked and they honked. Let's put that in perspective. Like, talking big picture, I just need to hammer that point home. That was the front. That was the lead up. And then you banned, it was truckers was the camel or the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last thing. You know why they had people lined up all over this country on the side of roads with signs? Children, elderly, every walk of life, every color, every race, every creed did not matter because it affected everyone the same.
Well, you're talking about emotion and I can see that the emotion in your face right now. And
it still hurts.
That, to me, that is what we're going to get out of the inquiry. Really, that to me is what we're going to get out of the inquiry. It's catharsis. All right. It is people having a release of emotions that they've pent up and they've built up over time. And this is catharsis. I actually don't have any faith at all that this EA will be deemed unjustified. And the reason why is I believe they're going to find it justified is simply because we do not have the means or the willpower to prosecute people if it is deemed unjustified. And I use for example the years during the 2016 election, for those couple of years, all we heard was, Hillary Clinton's going to go to jail, lock her up.
Yeah.
And then I heard the same thing afterwards. Oh, Donald Trump, lock him up. And what they don't realize is that there is no political will to do that because it opens too many legal doors. Now, comparing the US to Canada,
with establishment always protects their own. Is that what you're getting?
Oh, well, 100%. They might hate Donald Trump, but at the end of the day, he's still an insider. And if they were to go after him, they would have to go after past presidents, future presidents. It sets a precedence. In Canada, with the EA, if they deem it unjustified, it opens legal doors that I don't think that we're ready for as a country. Because if it's deemed unjustified, bring on the criminal potential trials, bring on the civil suits. There is a lot of potential for further redress. And I don't believe that our government has the institutional willpower to go through with that, because at the end of the day, even the government officials that believe that it's unjustified, well, at the end of the day, they don't want to make a mistake, because they're worried, okay, well, then in the future, this might be used against me. So I don't believe they have the willpower. I'm sorry. I know it's not what people want to hear, and maybe I'm just being a little too black pilled here. Maybe I should be more white pilled. But at the end of the day, I look at it and I say, well, of course they're going to find that it's justified. They can't find it any other way. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the case law built around it. But the most dangerous thing is that the glass has been broken on this. The glass has been broken on this, and all these liberals that cheered it on and cheered on the police going in there, beating the crap out of people. Just remember, one day it might be used against something that you support.
And that's been my concern all along. Like we talk about, the threshold is high on the Emergencies Act for a reason. It's literally the suspension of civil liberties. It's like, as you said earlier, it's a bludgeon. It's meant to stop something abruptly. You stop rights. It's a bludgeon tool. And if the threshold is as low as, this is my concern from the beginning, I was inconvenienced for a prolonged period of time. I was annoyed for a prolonged period of time. That's really dangerous, because you talked about it. One day, Trudeau won't be in power if that's your guy. And maybe there's going to be somebody in power that you don't like. And then you go out with a very legitimate protest in your eyes. And we could agree or disagree with whatever we're talking about in general in terms of this protest. But for a hypothetical, you go out, you protest, and all of a sudden the EA is invoked. And because the threshold's been set so low, all the government has to say is that you're basically inconveniencing people. That there's prolonged periods of noise. Is that the threshold we're setting here? I mean, there's a very clear laid out level of what the expectation is. And I actually think instead of using our own words here, why don't we just bring in Miller laying out the Emergencies Act? I think maybe now's a good time.
There was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act requires several things. One, it could be invoked due to espionage and sabotage. Are you going to hear any evidence about espionage and sabotage? The answer to that is no. Two, it could be invoked on the basis of clandestine or deceptive foreign influence, or foreign influence that involves a threat to a person. Are you going to hear evidence about that? The answer to that is no. It also could be invoked on the basis of threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. Are you going to hear evidence of violence against persons or property? The answer is no. Lastly, it can also be invoked if there is a group or persons trying to destroy or overthrow by violence the system of government of Canada. Are you going to hear evidence about individuals trying to do that? The answer is no.
Saskatchewan's position.
So, I mean, that's the threshold. That is the legal threshold that's required.
Now, I'm just going to say this. Everything that was said there, and I agree 100%, is subjective. Everything that was said there is subjective. So, for example, if you follow the left-wing media sources, you're hearing that the police and even CSIS was actively providing intelligence to the protesters.
I'll pull that up now for everyone here. Go ahead.
So that's, that's sort of stuff that that you've heard if you're on the left, that the espionage portion was met. And if you remember, there were stories about some of the truckers and protesters. I think they were trying to set fire to something, some form of arson. Again, if you're on the left side of the spectrum, or, there are some liberals that don't agree with everything that happened as well. So I'm going to say, if you're on the side that invoking the EA was justified, then you're going to look for the evidence that confirms your bias, your viewpoint. And if you are on the right, you are going, or if you are, not necessarily on the right, I shouldn't say that, because there is people, on different sides of the political spectrum, you're going to find the evidence that matches what you believe in your worldview. What I see looking at the big picture on the way back is I'm seeing a government that's completely incompetent and inept at dealing with crisis situations. And I'm seeing a group of people that majority of them went to Ottawa to protest, and there were small fractions within that group that were there for personal gratification, whether it is to boost their own image, their own name. And some of them are what I would consider like the sovereign citizen types, and that don't believe in the legitimacy of the government regardless. So at the end of the day, we have to look back and we have to realize that there is two sides to this. However, that doesn't mean that the Emergency Act was justified in being passed. One of the concerns I have with the Emergency Act, a very big concern that I really found disturbing, was that when the Emergency Act was first implemented, there was no accountability. They just enacted the Emergency Act. And then I believe it was the day before, and correct me if I'm wrong, the day before they had to actually go and justify it to Parliament, they said, we don't need the Emergency Act anymore. The situation's been resolved. So to me, it's like a light switch. Dictator today and democracy tomorrow. Dictator today, democracy tomorrow. The Emergency Act should not come with a time frame where you are not accountable for enacting such a thing. And that was really, really concerning to me.
And touch on something there a little bit, like anytime you have any crowd of any size, crowd dynamics, right? You're gonna, so if the rule is 1% or even 0.1%, right? What happens when you have 10,000 people? If 1% of them are a little bit out there, maybe a little bit rowdy, are the ones that are going to cause the disturbance. Crowd dynamics. If you have 10,000 people and the rule's 1% or 0.5%, whatever, you're going to get a number of those types. And that's all it takes to taint, in the eyes of many that are looking for that affirmation of their viewpoint, an entire protest, an entire group of people. So if you had 10,000 people, say it's 100 people, that's your 1%. Or 10 people, sorry. If you had 10 people that are causing disturbance all over the city, it's going to make the news. It's going to be reported on. And that's kind of how crowd dynamic, and it played out. And I hate this because I covered Black Lives Matter in Kitchener when that protest went on. And, if you wanted to look for ways of kind of going at their protest, I thought it was inappropriate that politicians were taking a knee to protesters in their demands. 1. 2, I thought it was a little unusual that there was children in the crowd, right? That was a big point of contention. And the smell of weed smoke filled the air. So that was my experience covering Black Lives Matter. Where was the negative coverage on it? No, it suited the narrative at the time. But crowd dynamics, you had the same issues there. You had the more extreme people that were kind of shouting, more disturbance. It's same, but different. Anytime you get a crowd of any size, that's, a reasonable size, that's a certain number of people, you're always going to get unsavory characters that tag along. And especially the longer it goes on, you're like, people are going to, like you said, are going to start going for their own purposes, for whether that be to get attention, money. I think it came up, Pat King as an example. There's $100,000 roughly that was seized in escrow that he was allegedly taking from donations from people to, I guess, get to Ottawa. $100,000, $100,000, one guy. I think some people weren't there for good reasons. I'm not saying they were there to cause issues for the residents of Ottawa, but there is definitely a lot of unsavory characters because, again, biggest protest, I think, in Canadian history that I can think of. I stand to be corrected if somebody can point one out. And it was an international story. So of course you're going to get some people that wanted a piece of that pie and
Well, and
wanted to interject themselves in.
And there's also just general curiosity too. I was watching one of the live streams at the Ambassador Bridge protest, and then I realized I actually saw like a friend I hadn't seen in years pass through the screen and realized that they were there. So I messaged them on Facebook and I said, "Hey, I just saw you on a live stream, at the Ambassador Bridge." And then we talked for a bit, and I just asked us, what are you there for? And that, like, is it because you're against the mandates and not just general curiosity? And they told me that they were there just to see what was going on, because there was this big protest and they just wanted to see what was going on. And I think they ended up buying well, yeah. And
I wanted to see, we wanted to see what was going on. We seen all this negative media coverage, and we wanted to see it for ourselves. You heard that time and time again from different people throughout the testimony, but also just in general. There's been many stories told like that.
Well, it's interesting, the legacy media, one of the reasons why they're having so much trouble controlling the narrative is that citizen journalism is a big thing now. Anyone that has a camera, a story, and a YouTube channel can practice journalism. There is no requirement to have a journalism license, which is why I think it's funny when I hear from journalists on both the left and the right saying, "Oh, well, listen to accredited journalists," and that. I'm like, well, what is an accredited journalist? Really?
Somebody who had the money to spend tens of thousands of dollars on an education that, by the way, my brother, if he's still watching, I love you, bud. But, he went to school for 2 years as a journalist. I think he would tell you that I'm probably better at this than him. I don't know for sure, but like, again, certain people have, the proclivity for certain things. And if you're a naturally curious person with a broad understanding of many things, you might be good at journalism. And it is funny when you talk about the, social media platforms have changed everything, because like a Canadian bestseller is what, 20,000? I just put out a video earlier last week that has 20,000 views. I'm a very small platform, but I say that to say social media has changed the game, and they're at a point now where you had 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people like myself, and everyone was tuning in from not all over this country, but all over the globe. And they couldn't control the narrative. And then you have all the mainstream media can put out all the messaging when they want. But now you're seeing the result of social media on something where there's many, many, many eyes on it, because it doesn't match with what we seen in the streets of Ottawa. There's so many live streams, so many videos that have been taken. It's hard for them to say just completely other people. And I think you're seeing that play out in the narrative coming out of the Public Order Emergency Commission, because they can't go all in and say, well, they're all bad. Well, we know that not to be true. So they've had to tamper, I guess, their approach to how they paint the protesters, because there's so much evidence to the contrary. Because again, like, everyone there now has a high definition camera and pretty good audio. Like, anybody can just pull up a cell phone now, shoot what they're seeing on site, and that immediately is a point of contention in any narrative they might try to paint.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that all the media was purposely attempting to engage in bad faith and that, but at the end of the day, the media is always going to try to provide what they believe their audience wants. And so if they need to frame things a certain way, if they need to make things look a certain way, then they're going to do that.
That's what I just mean about biases come through, and they can't do that when you have they can't do it as easily, I should say, when you have hundreds of people on the street that potentially are debunking your narrative that your biasy that you're putting forth.
So I actually want to bring up something that was mentioned in the comments. So Leonard mentioned in the comments, actually, when the EA is implemented, it's not supposed to suspend citizens' rights as little as possible. So I've heard that several times, and that's a narrative that I absolutely hate to hear, because I do not believe for a second what is that narrative that I heard from another journalist. Well, your rights are enshrined within the EA. No, they're not. The whole point of using the EA is to bring that bludgeon down. You know, the problem is, and I keep hearing this over and over, well, your rights are still being protected. Your rights are still being protected. In order for your rights to be protected, it would mean that your rights weren't molested in the first place. So the very first time your rights are infringed upon, they've infringed on your rights. What I can't stand is when I hear this, well, your rights are being protected, are still protected. Your charter rights are still protected. No, the government has to be brought to court, and then it has to be determined by a judge that your rights were infringed upon. So the government can come in, they can infringe on your rights, and then you have to hire a lawyer.
Assuming you can afford to hire a good lawyer, right? Law's only as good as the judge is fair and as your representation is qualified, et cetera, et cetera.
Then you have to go to court and you have to plead your case that let's say the Emergency Act infringed on your rights. A judge has to agree, and then you actually have to go and you have to determine, the judge will, in the court system, will determine the penalty for that. That is a lot of time. That is a lot of energy. And most people aren't going to go through with that. So when I hear this stuff about, oh, well, your rights are still protected, I don't believe that for a second, because if your rights were protected, then they wouldn't have been infringed upon in the first place.
If they were protected, there's no need for the EA. But I think now's a good point in time. Let's open it up to a more general discussion of maybe some key takeaways you've had from the commission. I'm just going to play a video because I think I'll give my comments after, but this is Pierre Poilievre, I guess today, discussing the Emergencies Act and the Public Order Emergency Commission. So we're just going to pull that in.
Another question. We have heard extensive testimony at the Emergencies Act inquiry, including concerns from police and national security agencies about elements inside the convoy. Has any of this changed your view of whether the Emergencies Act should have been invoked? And if you had known what has been revealed in the testimony so far, would you still have supported the convoy? Do you still support it now?
So my position is the same as it was before the convoy arrived, the same as it was during, and the same as it is now, which is this. I support those peaceful and law-abiding protesters who demonstrated for their lives and livelihoods and liberties, while condemning any individual who broke laws, behaved badly, or blockaded critical infrastructure. I think it's possible to support the overall cause of personal free choice in vaccination and the overall cause of respecting the truckers' ability to earn an income, while holding individually responsible anyone who behaved badly, broke laws, or blockaded key infrastructure. That was my position before, during, and now.
Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Oh man, the Conservative Party. Oh man.
Yeah, take it away. Let's get your thoughts.
Well, okay. Here's my thoughts. The Conservative Party of Canada, if COVID has done anything, it ravaged the Conservative Party of Canada. That's for sure. I mean, under the old leader, Aaron O'Toole, definitely the Conservative Party, they took some major hits because they stayed so quiet. And, you know, we had videos of Maxime Bernier out there getting arrested in Manitoba, attending all sorts of different, you know, rallies, and just energizing, you know, people about, you know, freedom of choice and liberty. And the Conservative Party was, for the majority of it, very, very quiet. I was very disappointed in the Conservative Party's approach. I think what they were trying to do, and I don't know for sure, I'm not a mind reader, and that if I could, I'd be in a completely different line of work. But I think what they were trying to do is they were waiting for the Liberals to screw up, and then they were going to try to pounce on them. That's what I think. But the thing is the Liberals are Teflon. What people don't understand, and I actually was talking, and I'm going to plug myself here for a second. My podcast, I was talking to a Conservative Party political consultant, and the problem is that the Liberals are absolute Teflon when it comes to these things. So I was severely disappointed. Pierre being head of the Conservative Party is a step in the right direction, but they have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of ground to make up for it. And, people like I see there, Bernier's heads above Pierre. I agree. But at the same time, Bernier is not going to form government anytime soon. So
don't say that. You'll upset a bunch of. You're right. I mean,
well, I'm just being realistic
of voting,
here.
Right? It's very unlikely that we see. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that Bernier doesn't have a chance to have some seats in the near future, but I'm sorry, he's not going to form government anytime soon. So, and that's just, and that's not me taking a dunk on Bernier. That's just the fact that it is a very, very young political party. And although they've made a lot of great strides, I also think sometimes you gotta walk or jog before you run. And yeah, Conservative Party, they have the chance to form government. And although I do agree that the Overton window is generally shifted more left, in that what's the thing I heard online, that the Conservative Party is just 10 years behind the Liberal Party in their policies or something. Well, I'll take a slowdown over the progressive overrun that we're seeing right now. So Conservative Party, good to see Pierre out there saying those things, but he's still fence sitting a bit too much. I have to agree with Brian. He's still fence sitting too much. And at the end of the day, what I believe the Conservative Party needs to do is they just need to take one solid stance. And like I talked about with Michael on my podcast, and then never apologize ever again. Don't ever apologize. Take a stance and never apologize, and stick by your guns on it.
I think that's a good summary of the Conservatives, though, over the last, just COVID. Like, how many you can
since
count
2015.
Highlighted especially by COVID, because you had who stood up right in the Conservative Party actively from early on. I mean, you had Baber, he was kicked out, I think. Leslyn Lewis later on, and then Belinda Carhalios. I think you had 4 MPs maybe you would say spoke out, and 2 of them I think were in the Conservative Party. And Pierre, my criticism of Pierre, listen, for over 2 years, you did not say a thing. You didn't find any fault in the government's handling. You didn't find it problematic. What was happening to the charter rights and here's a big one that I think is lost on people. Over the course of COVID, we went from the idea of the Western individual to the Western collective. That is the biggest fundamental paradigm shift that has happened, where we're now talking about the greater good. And the West was founded on the sovereign individual under God. That is what makes, in my mind, our country so great. And as our nation so great, as somebody said to me, even if you don't believe in God, you should want that to be the highest law of the land, because if it doesn't come from God, it comes from government. And we're at a point now, if it's not higher than the government, and the government's saying it's for the greater good, now we can manipulate all sorts of data, all sorts of information to suit our narrative, and your rights are going to suffer. To back this up, I don't care what anyone did on I'm trying to say this without getting a flag, but on the Jimmy jabs, whatever, if I don't care what you did, but we were at a point where we treated people no longer like individuals who had the right to make up their own individual mind. No. It was about the greater good. Even though the vast majority of people, if you looked at the stats early on, there really wasn't, in my opinion, concern if you were under the age of 50. But yet you were told that you're going to need to do this thing for the greater good in order to access society, etc. And that shook out. And my issue is, for 2+ years, the conservatives, not even fence that. They were on the same side, in my mind, as the liberals. They were high-fiving them. Not really, but the only difference was they were on the same side of the fence as the liberals. It's just, we would have done it better. We would have brought in the vaccines faster. And you've seen the same thing in the United States, right? When Trump, Operation Warp Speed, they get it. It's like, oh, it's bad. It's bad. Don't get it. Don't get it. And Biden gets elected. It's like, oh, yeah, you should go get it. It's good. 2 years, liberals have been doing, or were doing whatever, and conservatives, there was no one. There's no core leadership that was speaking out. Anyone that spoke out was ousted. And the only difference I could see in the handling is that basically the conservatives said they would have done the same things better, and maybe more, I guess you would say, more fiscally responsible, which isn't a very high bar in Canada when Trudeau's been at the helm for 7+ years.
Well, and that's going back to the Harper years of conservatism, which is economy, fiscal responsibility, and that. But again, we've moved past simply just talking about fiscal responsibility. Politics is downstream from culture, and everything these days is based on culture. So I'm disappointed in how the Conservative Party dealt with COVID overall, their stance on things, which was basically a non-stance. And then now they're coming out, and I mean, it's a new leadership team. They got new kind of public relations communication directors, and that it's funny, they tried to shame her on the first day that she took office for public communications by showing a picture or a video of her in Ottawa honking one of the horns, and she did exactly what she needed to do, which was to say, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm not apologizing. So it's nice to see that as a turn, but at the same time, I'm not convinced yet that they're going to turn it around at all. And what's kind of, talking about runoff from the Emergency Act itself is now we're seeing with the notwithstanding clause in Ontario, for using the notwithstanding clause, and the screeching and the gnashing of teeth from the leftists over that. And frankly, it is the hypocrisy is, or the irony is palpable, I'd say. But at the same time, the Emergency Act is different than the notwithstanding clause. And I think we've set a very bad precedent with the Emergency Act, with the notwithstanding clause being used in Quebec for Bill C-21, whether we agree or disagree on it. We're becoming a country now where I believe that Confederation itself is at risk. I truly believe
Absolutely.
Confederation is at risk. Saskatchewan, where I'm at, where we're both at, is now talking about I think it's Saskatchewan First Act now. And I can see other provinces joining in, just seeing how badly Ottawa handles these issues, whether it's the Emergency Act, whether it's sticking their nose into provincial business with the notwithstanding clause. Ottawa has gotten way too brazen. The federal government has gotten way too brazen with how they handle things. And I think that it's going to have a major runoff effect on the provinces. And it's no longer just going to be Quebec leading the pack on the whole sovereignty deal. I think that we're going to see a big shift in the West. And I don't know. I don't believe that's going to be a good thing overall. But at the end of the day, we'll have to see how it all plays out. But with the Emergency Act inquiry, the longer the inquiry goes on, the more I just see that it that the federal government is just so completely inept to deal with anything.
Well, I mean, that's a bigger discussion, but I think we could agree. I don't think this is a system that's working for Canadians. If you live in Ontario and you live in Quebec, you're deciding for the rest of the country. We don't have a voice out here. We don't. We're like the little brother everyone likes to make fun of, but we're the little brother who got rich and sends all the money to the rest of the family. It's that's a heavy discussion for sure. But one of the things I wanted to touch on, or sorry, if you want to add a point there.
I want to kind of add one more point. The problem, what led to the Emergency Act is this normalization of centralization of power overall. For example, every single time something inconveniences a municipal, a provincial, or the federal government, now they're declaring a state of emergency because it opens up the coffers. It opens up additional resources. So I've seen this with out here in Saskatchewan with the wildfires and things like that. Every time there's something that happens that seems to inconvenience the government, they just declare a state of emergency. And there's certain things that come with that, opening up of all sorts of different resources for them. And that's become the go-to. That is the status quo now. So it is not lost on me that is what's led to the government feeling comfortable enough to enact the Emergencies Act, because everything now is an emergency. Because our government's
so low, yeah.
Well, our governments can't handle anything in a normal day-to-day basis. Anything that slightly upsets the status quo sends everyone into this hair on fire panic. And that is how we've been governing all levels of our government for years now. And so the Emergency Act is just the next step. And it's not good. And it just showcases that we've legislated ourselves into a corner on the different government levels here. So there's big implications to this. And when we look at the lead up to the EA, the comfort of enabling the Emergency Act, I mean, at the end of the day, we have a criminal code that's like this thick. And every year they add more and more laws to the criminal code. You're telling me that they could not use any other provisions under the criminal code to deal with this? We have Section 63-1, unlawful assembly. An unlawful assembly is an assembly of three or more persons who, with the intent to carry out any common purpose, assemble in such a manner or so conduct themselves when they are assembled as to cause persons in the neighborhood of the assembly to fear on reasonable grounds that they will A, disturb the peace tumultuously, will by that assembly needlessly and without reasonable cause provoke other persons to disturb the peace tumultuously. So we have laws on there. And let's say the police had gone in and said, listen, we're now declaring this an unlawful assembly. We're now requesting that, you need to disperse or start dispersing. We're going to help you do this. We're going to, we'll start, funneling trucks out of the city, whatever. And if they had refused to do that, we have in here, we have the Riot Act, Section 64. A riot is an unlawful assembly that has begun to disturb the peace tumultuously. All right. And all they have to do is they have to get the mayor, a justice, or a sheriff to read out the riot proclamation. And then the protesters have 30 minutes to disperse. After that, there is additional legal protections for peace officers to basically disperse the crowd. That doesn't mean they have to do it violently, but they have additional legal protections and that to disperse. And again, I'm not saying that needs to be done violently at all, but instead of trying to use these, other tools, if they feel that they couldn't negotiate or anything like that, because I do agree that when it comes to the police, someone referred to me to me how the police should operate before is that it's an iron fist covered with a velvet glove. So you want to try to massage situations first. You want to try to find a peaceful resolution to things, negotiate, and then if that does not work, well, you're the damn police. You have resources at your disposal. The OPP, I mean, listening to the commissioner of the OPP, his testimony alone, in my opinion, should have just shut down the inquiry. His testimony alone, because I believe he told the truth, and the truth does not match the need whatsoever for the Emergency Act to be passed. And I mean, again, the police are going to know best, especially the provincial police, because they seem to kind of have had their head together a little bit more than the Ottawa police did.
Well, we have numerous levels of policing now that have taken the stand and testified. The Emergencies Act was useful, but not required. And why was it useful? Well, again, slowly testified extensively to this. Did not have the resources. That should be the bigger picture. We're talking the big picture of the EA here. That should terrify Canadians. We didn't have the resources to do what we needed to do on a policing front. And it's not a new problem. It's a problem that's persistent all across Canada.
What happens when there's actually a real emergency? Really, at the end of the day, if that was emergency that required the EA, what happens when we have an actual emergency? Like something really, really
actual violent uprising and they need to quell it. Like, yeah, they struggled and they said they needed it for parked vehicles and honking. Like, if you just accept them at their word, that's what they needed it for. You're right. What are they going to do if there was a real threat to Canada? And this isn't a new problem. They've been highlighting staffing shortages, the need for more police resources. It's been an ongoing issue for decades at least. They're drastically underfunded. Hey, we've heard this before. Healthcare, right? Oh, the hospitals were overrun because of COVID. No. Hospitals have been overrun for decades. This is a recurring issue in Canada, and these major problems that arise, like the Ottawa Freedom Convoy or COVID, they just shine a very bright light on the problems that existed beforehand. In the case of Ottawa, it shines a light on the lack of police resources, on the lack of organization, and especially, I wanted to touch on this, the lack of leadership. We've seen politicians, but all sorts of levels of government. I would argue policing, maybe not the same, but in politics, everything's about short-term gain. They concede ground to win in the short term, but lose in the long term. And what I mean by that is, we're worried that if we're too hard right now on the COVID thing and we say we don't agree with what's happening, people are afraid and we're worried we'll lose support. Cool. Weather the storm. That's leadership. Paint the vision. Stand on principle. It's not that hard, guys. Like, when people like myself are just factory workers, we're like, I don't get it. Why aren't you doing this? It's pretty simple to me, but they stick their finger up in the air and they go, well, what's good for me right now? And there's this lack of leadership all across the country, and just certain events shine a very bright light on these problems that have existed in Canada for decades, whether it be the healthcare and COVID. Like, I shared at the beginning of this, I think it was a couple months into it, an article from, I think it was CTV or CBC, 2019, rape a year prior, and they were talking about overrun hospitals, and some hospitals were at 100% capacity for the entire year. They had some hospitals that were like 130% capacity for like 6 months. Remember, everyone, Doug Ford ran on what? Ending hallway medicine. That's a pre-existing problem. When it comes to police, this isn't a new issue as far as enforcement having lack of resources. Slowly testified. It was 2 days. We did not have the resources. Let's put this in perspective. The big picture of the EA. They are saying they didn't have the necessary resources to even go block by block, provide protection. They were worried whatever about the crowd dynamics. Okay, fine. Didn't even have enough enforcement power to go in and just get vehicles towed or ticket them, for crying out loud. How many people didn't receive tickets while they were there? It came up in the EA. If you were consistently ticketed day after day, would the mounting fines may have caused you to leave? Yeah, I bet you a lot of people would have. Because guess what? Bylaw infraction, that ain't one you're going to win. Right? But they couldn't even do these basic things. And my point, we talked offline, but if you don't finish step one, if you don't do the basics, the laws on the books, here's how you deal with this. How are you ever going to justify step 2 or step 3 or step 50 of the Emergencies Act? Like, I can't fathom how we justify this. And it's concerning because we touched on it earlier. If the threshold is this low, there will be a day when there's a leader you don't like who believes differently than you, and that threshold is low, and he can use the same tool that was used against your enemy, it'll be used against you. That's why people like myself are saying, listen, I don't care where you fall on this. It's very important that this actually meets the legal threshold, that we don't sensationalize and narratize this to suit the political whims of the parties in power. Because 10 years from now, if we concede this ground, how will we talk about the people that went to Ottawa, arguably the biggest protest in Canadian history, internationally inspired many other countries? How are we going to talk about that if the narrative sits that there's a bunch of crazy people that ran into Ottawa and, they were just so bad and they're honking and we accept that as the basis? My kids 10 years from now, if this stands, when that threshold is that low, I'd be worried about them going to protest, because all it would take is the government indicating that they don't like it and the EA. And now, I mind you, it's a big political tool. I think it needs to be put in perspective. This is viewed as a very big event, and people are putting it very high in their minds as to the seriousness of it. It went on 3 weeks, but I don't think, as we talked about, it's in anywhere. It's not even the same stadium. It's not the same city as a real domestic terrorist threat or as any number of real legitimate threats. When you have to get on the stand and try to narratize and make people seem crazy because they lost their jobs and went to protest and it was honking, I mean, I think you lost the plot. And that's the scary part. It's terrifying to me if that threshold sits so low that one day, like, I worry what the world will look like 10, 20 years from now for Canada, for my kids. Because again, it's just, if a government is just an inconvenience for a prolonged period of time. I'm not saying it wasn't rough for certain individuals, but my goodness, we're talking about bylaw infractions and honking. And they weren't ticketing consistently. They weren't towing. They didn't do the basic step 1 stuff. And we're just going to accept that narrative that this is okay. Because the big takeaway people are missing, the Public Order Emergency Commission, the threat, whether or not they rule either way, is inconsequential. They could say it wasn't justified. Justice Rouleau could say, yeah, it wasn't justified. The real question is, what does the court of public opinion say? If the public perception is that I don't give a dang, I think, based on what I've heard, it was justified, it will stand. And that's the concern around this. How this is talked about, how this is remembered, matters a great deal. We can't allow inconsistencies in the narrative, lies in the narrative persist. And that's why I go back to, like, the beginning I laid out. There's 2 different narratives that have emerged. You had a bigger protest than anyone expected, converged on Ottawa. I hate to use the sound converge. It just sounds bad. Anyways, all these people from all across Canada come into Ottawa, and it surpassed anyone's expectations. It was rowdy for about a week, and it got better. And then the other narrative is the complete opposite. They started, it was okay, but as time went on, it got worse. Well, I'm really concerned on that second narrative, if that is allowed to stand. Because if it is allowed to stand, you can already see where they're going with it. Okay, we didn't have control over all the groups. Okay, you didn't know who was there. Okay, it got worse over time. Oh, and by the way, when the lawyer brings up that they're getting information from, police and CSIS, like, you want to talk about public perception? I wish I could find it. Where is it? Here we are. Convoy got steady stream of leaked information from police security officials. Lawyer for the protesters, Keith Wilson, brought that up. Now, like, you want to talk about helping that narrative be painted in people's mind, the public perception, forget the threshold, right? Because most people don't care about what the actual legal threshold is. But in public perception, it's like, if It got worse as it went on. They didn't have control of it. Oh, and by the way, they were receiving information from leaked security forces or some security and police forces. I mean, I don't know. Public perception might look at that information and go, Trudeau was right. In fact, it has been trending across Twitter. Hashtag Trudeau was right. Mind you, that's left-wing Twitter. But the point stands.
It's public perception, and it's public perception is so easily swayed overall. I think at the end of the day, we got to wait and see how it plays out. I'm really worried how it's going to play out, because it seems like a lose-lose situation overall, because if it was found to be justified, then you're going to have such a low bar for the Emergency Act to be used. If it's found not justified, which is what I hope the result is, that's going to open up a whole new section of law, because the next step will be individual prosecution of political members that made that call.
And your black-pilled self just does not see that happening.
Well, I'm a pessimist by nature. I'm an absolute pessimist by nature, and I just feel like the government is the government is a circle the wagon. It's a self-isolating, insulating apparatus. So I fully believe that in the interests of the overall governmental control, that they will find the Emergency Act justified, because they would much rather have a low bar threshold than open up that door for prosecution and of people that made that call. That's my opinion. I hope that it's found not justified and we can enter into a new era of accountability, but I'm not holding my breath on it.
All right. And like we're coming up on an hour 10 here, so maybe we should close up with concluding thoughts. Is there anything that comes to your mind that you think is worth covering? I mean, there's so much that you could cover. We could be on here for hours and hours.
Well,
I
think my final thoughts on this is simply, there's going to be a lot of people on the right and the left in the media. They're going to be telling you this is how things are. I actually recommend that people follow the media that they despise and they read what is being said.
Yeah.
And if anything, if it makes you feel better about listening and reading it, you got to know your enemy at the end of the day. So that's a key rule if you're going to be involved in political discussions, and that is, you should try to know your opponent and understand their point of view, even if you disagree with it. So my closing thoughts are, don't just look at the media that supports what you want to believe. Look at the other side, even if it makes you grind your teeth every second, because believe me, there's been a few reporters and I'm grinding my teeth every second listening to them, as I believe they're just BSing me and gaslighting. But at the end of the day, I have to try to look at their perspective, if only to be able to counter it, hopefully with the most accurate information. Because here's the thing, Ben Shapiro says facts don't care about your feelings. Feelings don't care about facts, and feelings and emotions is what guides people. So at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are looking and saying, okay, why am I agreeing with this? And what does that say about me overall as well? And again, that's not me taking the side of, the left or anything like that. At the end of the day, by looking at and reading and listening to the other side of the story, I can help, what I like to call steel man my arguments the best that I can.
I would agree with that. Like it's vitally important, regardless of what your personal opinions, biases are. If you're going to be effective in having any influence, you need to understand the opposite point of view. You need to understand it better than they do. And one thing you touched on there, I talk about public perception, and you touched on it again, but the heart moves before the mind. People feel before they think. And it can't be lost that people are very strong in their emotions, whether they're on one side of this argument or on the other. They either absolutely think like literally domestic terrorists were in Ottawa, and it's that strong of an opinion, or that it was like, complete. I don't know how you would describe it from the opposite point, but like it's missed on people what went through, or what a lot of people went through as a result of the policies that were pushed. So putting that in perspective, yeah, the heart moves before the mind. So if you're going to be effective in ever influencing the opposite side to come around to your point of view, you better understand how their heart's thinking, are feeling. Because if you don't, you're never going to have a chance to move their mind. And I think that's probably a good place to end it. Tell people where they can find your work.
All right. So if you're looking at my name on the screen, I'm on Twitter. CoffeeBreathCo1 is my Twitter handle, and I do a Substack, CoffeeBreathConversations.substack.com. I also do a podcast, and that's at CoffeeBreathConversations.com. So that's where you can find me if you're interested. And yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, Greg, having me on your show today to talk about. It's interesting being on the other side of usually I'm kind of the interviewer. So it's interesting being on the other side of the spectrum. I appreciate everyone that tuned in. I really appreciate, BJ was on earlier, and, he did correct. I did say something incorrectly earlier, and I was glad he was there to actually correct me and tell me, because he was there on the ground. I wasn't. I had friends and family that were there, but I wasn't on the ground there myself. So I appreciate that, and appreciate everyone that tuned in. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your honesty on that. And I think the same desire from you is the same as ours here. I don't care about being right. We just want to get it right. And what I mean by that is I don't want to just belong to the tribe and push a narrative. I want to make sure that I've explored all my biases, the other side. I want to make sure I get it right, get the truth. That's Diverge Media, stories that matter. Truth falls where it falls. Until next time, everyone.